The Badab War was one of the most insidious and dangerous conflicts to strike the Imperium of Man in recent history, fought between the year 901 and 913 of the 41st millennium. This war turned entire armies of the Imperium's most powerful warriors against each other, and in doing so, swept millions to their death in its turbulence. To understand the conflict, we must understand the Maelstrom Zone, situated along the eastern fringe in the Segmentum Ultima. The region of the galaxy, now known as the Maelstrom Zone, was first explored during the Great Crusade of the 31st millennium. Second in size and extent only to the Eye of Terror, the Maelstrom is a vast warp rift that scars both the physical universe and the fabric of the immaterium beyond. The Maelstrom covers an area many hundreds of light years across, and its presence in space is marked by a vast, slowly turning gyre comprised of nebulae, dust, and stellar material, in which countless stars and worlds have long been lost to the immaterium. During the Great Crusade, vast armies of the Emperor of Mankind attempted to penetrate the Maelstrom and cleanse it of the evils that lurked within. The wealth of the worlds bordering the Maelstrom have drawn mankind to the Maelstrom Zone time and again, despite its manifold hazards and difficulties. The Maelstrom Zone has drawn humanity's enemies as well, in countless numbers and diverse loathsome forms. Hundreds of warships and thousands of troops were lost in the early campaigns during the Great Crusade era, and with the rest of the galaxy to reconquer, the Emperor declared the region Purgatus. In the years following the Horus Heresy, Primarch Galen of the Ultramarine Space Marine Legion decided that the inhabitants of the Maelstrom were too great a threat to the shaky stability of the recovering Imperium to ignore, and ordered the surrounding regions reinforced in an effort to contain any attacks that might originate from within. Over time, the Imperium slowly established several important Imperial outposts within the Maelstrom Zone during the 38th and 39th millennia. These outposts rose to prominence as flickering beacons of human influence and strength within the region. The three vital star systems that formed the links to a distant chain that allowed the resources of the Maelstrom Zone to flow into the coffers of the more established Imperial sectors beyond were the star systems of Signax, Sagan, and Badab. As the situation in the Maelstrom became ever more volatile, this path of Imperial commerce came increasingly under threat. By the middle of the 41st millennium, the heavily militarized hive world of Signax, located in the star system of the same name, was the most populated planet in the northern Maelstrom Zone. Having long been a linchpin of Imperial control of the region, Signax was a key strategic world, forming a bulwark against an aggressor and serving as a safe port for Imperial merchants and naval vessels. In the year 557 of the 41st millennium, disaster struck, when with the suddenness of an unrushing storm, Signax succumbed to corruption from within and attack from without. The planet rapidly fell into a bloody civil war between the Imperial garrison and death cult nihilists, backed by the intervention of the dreaded Chaos Space Marine warband known as the Reborn. Despite the intervention of the Mantis Warrior Space Marine chapter, which itself had made a home in the nearby subsector, the death toll rose exponentially into the millions. The death cultists managed to gain access to part of the Signaxian missile defense network, and in a suicidal rage, unleashed a rain of atomic and plasma warheads upon the doomed world, shattering its hive cities and disrupting the planet's orbit for several years. The resulting permanent nuclear winter, radioactive fallout, and tectonic upheavals annihilated all life on Signax. With the fall of its key world, Imperial control of the northern Maelstrom Zone swiftly crumbled. Without Signax, along with other Imperial losses suffered in the region over the previous few centuries, vital military supply chains stretching as far as Bacca and Terra itself were threatened, forcing the Adeptus Terra to act. In the year 587 of the 41st millennium, the High Lords of Terra pronounced an Edict Imperialis in response to these dire threats, ordering several Space Marine chapters to permanently base themselves in the Maelstrom Zone in order to protect the Imperium's interests and pacify the region. In recognition of their past glorious service to the Imperium, the Astroclaws chapter was given the high honor of the senior role in commanding the newly formed Maelstrom Warders. This force was to include the fleet-based Lamenters and Cardinal Guard chapter to patrol the outer regions, and also incorporated the Mantis Warriors, who were based in a nearby cluster. Once this force was put in place, the Astroclaws chapter took over the orbital battle station in a strategically vital Badab system, which became their fortress monastery and base of operation. After their establishment, a detachment of an Imperial Navy squadron was permanently assigned to the region to conduct search and destroy and convoy protection duty. This naval detachment quickly established the surrounding areas and purged the inner zones of heretical and Xenos elements that had plagued them. Soon the wealth of the Maelstrom Zone once again began to flow into the coffers of the Imperium. The greatest operation during this time occurred during the Scourge campaign in the year 640 to 651 of the 41st millennium, in which the Astroclaws and their dire allies conducted a series of major combat operations, striking deep into the heart of the Maelstrom in an attempt to take battle to the foe. Initially, the Space Marines were successful until the abrupt withdrawal of the Cardinal Guard chapter. The Adeptus Terra severed the chapter's tie to the Warders, dispatching them to the Thantos Crusade in the Vild region. This sudden loss effectively ended the campaign. The Astroclaws subsequently petitioned for a replacement chapter to be reassigned, but were denied. Less than 2 decades later, the Warders suffered a series of setbacks and a high number of casualties among some of their allies, causing a rift in relations between the wider Imperium and the Maelstrom Warders during this period. Soon, the Warders became hard-pressed by an upsurge of demonic incursions and Corsair attacks, pushing them into an increasingly defensive posture and suspending all operations near the Maelstrom itself. Once again, disaster struck as a series of Orc raids originating within the Maelstrom struck deep in the Badab sector during the Battle of Helsiris. The Astroclaws chapter master, Rovik Blake, went against his own doctrine and pursued the Orcs back into the Maelstrom itself. Having led the Astroclaws for the last 2 centuries, he fell in single combat with an Orc warboss, Vorg Manburna, and forcing the Astroclaws to retreat. On return to the Badab system, the captain of the Astroclaws' 3rd Company, Lufton Huron, was appointed as chapter master by popular acclaim of his peers in the year 715 of the 41st millennium. He became the youngest warrior in the chapter's history to attain this esteemed rank. Imperial historians now point out that such a man of flawed character should have never been allowed to rise to the command of a Space Marine chapter. But Huron had already proven to be an exceptional warrior, as well as a skilled tactician and charismatic leader. He quickly reorganized the chapter's strategic deployments and established a policy of expanding his chapter's fleet, which had been badly depleted, including within its ranks captured Corsair vessels in aggressive raids. He also established the questionable Scorched Planet policy against their enemies and increased the chapter's stockpile of Exterminatus-class weapons. This resulted in several fringe worlds that harbored renegade ships and a past being turned into lifeless husks. In the year 718 of the 41st millennium, a failed coup attempt on the hive world of Badab Primaris led to an abortive civil war, and the Astroclaws stepped in and brutally crushed the conflict. In the aftermath, the elements behind the coup were brought forth to Huron for judgment. Mindful of the lessons of Signax, the chapter master personally took matters into his own hands, swiftly reimposing order once more. This time, he employed the Astroclaws much more brutally as he executed much of the planet's ruling class, as well as purging those they perceived as morally wrong. Taking upon himself the mantle of planetary ruler, Huron established himself as the tyrant of Badab, claiming the inhabited worlds in proximity to the hospitable region of the void around the Badab system as his chapter's fiefdom. In his subsequent pronouncement, he echoed the example and the precedent of the sovereign realm of Ultramar and the Warders chapter. The nearby system was soon purged wholesale of the ruling elite, and in the decades afterward, a number of Astral Claws watch stations were established. The tyrant's chosen servants and political allies were placed in positions of power, turning the Badab sector into a pocket empire, commanded by the Astral Claws. To further cement his power in a massive reorganization of the uneven and often isolationist native planetary defense force in the region into what would become known as the Tyrant's Legion. Following the unified command structure, these forces now followed a standard dictates of Huron. The Astral Claws assigned detachments to further train the Tyrant's Legion in order to purge them of weak elements. Soon the Tyrant's Legion proved their worth as they repulsed numerous Corsair raids, freeing the Astral Claws from their defensive stance. The chapter was able to conduct a series of lightning raids into outlying areas to harass and destroy heretics and Xenos controlled areas. With the increase of Huron's tally of victories and the curtail of Corsair activity and the increase of production never before reached, the fame of the Astral Claws tyrant grew beyond the Maelstrom Zone. Spurred by his success, Huron had his servants deliver a formal and lengthy petition to Terra, making a detailed case for completely subduing the Maelstrom and the surrounding areas, which would greatly benefit the Imperium in the long term. In order to achieve this, Huron advocated the deployment of several more Space Marine chapters to the Warders, suggesting even that a new founding might even be warranted to meet the needs of this plan. Unfortunately, Huron's petition was dismissed without full hearing on the grounds that the requirements of the Imperium were better met elsewhere. During the mid-700th year of the 41st millennium, the Astral Claw's submission of required gene seed tithes to the Adeptus Mechanicus became infrequent and incomplete. Although initially a cause for concern, such matters were not uncommon, particularly those Space Marine chapters deployed to border areas or on crusade, simply because the chapter itself might have a temporary need to retain the gene seed itself to sustain battlefield losses. But as the omissions persisted, this signaled to the Mechanicus that there was some darker motive at work. This would later prove to be true with the Astral Claws, as evidence later indicated that this first great sin against the traditions of the Astarte would arguably result in the chapter's fall into heresy. Repeatedly denied the reinforcement he had requested to aid him and the Maelstrom Warders in carrying out their task. In his arrogance and pride, the tyrant sought to expand his forces into a force equal to a Space Marine Legion of old. Further covert investigation would later uncover that the Astral Claws Apothecarion were conducting heretical experiments in rapid zygote cultivation. Though largely unsuccessful, the Astral Claws eventually stood at around an estimated 3,500 battle brothers strong. In the year 729 of the 41st millennium, Huron's servants delivered a formal document of petition to the High Lords of Terra, making a detailed case for complete purging and subduing the Maelstrom and the surrounding areas. In order to achieve this, the document set out the case for a massively augmented deployment of Space Marines to the Maelstrom Warders. Huron's petition was once again dismissed without a full hearing on the grounds that the Imperium's needs were better met elsewhere. After further requests to redistribute resources from the Maelstrom Zone were denied and met with increased quota demands from the Administratum, in protest, Huron withheld Badab Primaris' planetary tithes to the Administratum, and further blockade the passage of trade through his realm in protest over the Adept's failure to provide him and his allies sufficient resources to police the Maelstrom. Refusing the Astral Claws' role as defenders of the Maelstrom Zone, the tyrant soon diverted the industrial resources and manpower to directly supplement the Badab sector's defenses, as well as augmenting the Maelstrom fleet detachment and fortification of key worlds under his command. These space-based defenses encircling the outer and inner spheres of the Badab sector became known as the Ring of Steel. On Badab Primaris, the tyrant ordered the demolition of the ancient citadel of the ruling Dominars, and instead erected the legendary, hugely fortified Palace of Thorns to his own specifications and design. The clashing entitlement of the Administratum's imperial tithes and the ancient rights of the Astarte commanders to defend the Imperium by any means necessary swiftly came to be known as the Badab Schism, and would last for more than a century and a half, during which the Astroclaws and the Maelstrom Warders would continue to carry on military operations as usual, against a volatile backdrop of worsening tensions with the Administratum and the Segmentum authorities. The sudden loss of the lifeblood of industry and commerce were keenly felt by the Cathagor sector. For more than 11 centuries, the Carthan lords and planetary governors had held the charter to distribute the industrial output of the Maelstrom Zone and guard its passage through the Administratum-controlled supply fortress of Sagan III, and then to the western Segmentum Ultima and beyond. Isolated by the vast distance, the Carthan had long grown fat and decadent, protected by the blood and toil of the more strife and torn realms. Freed from their inglorious garrison duty, the Astroclaws intervened in the aftermath of the infamous Fourth Quadrant Rebellion, which had troubled the Imperium for many decades. Gathering in a mixed task force comprising of various companies from the Astroclaws, Firehawks, White Scars, and Celestian Guard chapter, backed by the Death Corps of Krieg and Kolsec Imperial Guard regiments, and finally the Titans from Legio Venator, Huron was elected battle leader by common consent. However, Stybor Lazarek, chapter master of the Firehawks, continued to harbor a grudge over the fact that Huron was given overall command despite his seniority as a chapter master. This grudge would fester over the coming years until finally it would bear the fruit of bitterness. In the year 821 of the 41st millennium, a heavily orc-raiding force from the Maelstrom was intercepted and destroyed in a series of battles in the Kirbar sector in the Eidmon cluster by a combined force of the Maelstrom Warders. During the battle, Huron slew Raka, the orc war boss, in single combat and was hailed as a hero of the people of Endymion. In the year 869 of the 41st millennium, at the instigation of their chapter master, the Black Templars declared a crusade of wrath into the Maelstrom, assaulting it from the eastward approach. Meanwhile, the Astroclaws, Lamenters, and Mantis warriors launched their own assault in the southern and northeastern approaches. Thanks in no small part to Huron's brilliant strategic planning, as well as the strength of the Maelstrom Warders and the Black Templars, they achieved a stunning victory against 23 alien or heretic stronghold worlds. Unfortunately, wider events intervened, once again putting a premature end to the Astroclaws' plan, as the Black Templars were called away to aid the beleaguered realm of Ultramar in the wake of the Tyrannic War. Having already suffered substantial losses in the campaign, the Warder chapter were forced to withdraw from the Maelstrom, much to Huron's fury. During this time, Huron was uncharacteristically reserved and withdrawn on his return from the Maelstrom, either locking himself away in the chapter's archives for days on end and refusing to see anyone, or keeping long silent vigils alone in the fortress monastery, gazing unblinkingly for hours at holospheres that depicted the Maelstrom Zone. Some observers say that it was during this time that Huron became corrupted and fell from grace. Denied his goal he had spent a lifetime fighting for, he had been denied his glory as it was snatched from his hands at the last moment by those he should call master, finally unhinged him, or maybe he had given in to hubris and false pride. Some of the tyrant's detractors have even gone so far as to suggest that during the Crusade of Wrath, while deep within the nightmare realm of the Maelstrom, something vile or warp-tainted promises had wormed their way into his heart. Matters worsened once again, not only within the Maelstrom Zone but the wider Imperium, as the threat of High Fleet Behemoth left the defenses of the Segmentum Ultima in disarray. The wars and rumors of wars as far as the Eye of Terror and the Ghoul Stars threatened to erupt, as well as a galaxy-wide revolt and other strange phenomena. Soon, crisis followed crisis, and in dying years of the 800th year of the 41st millennium, Huron saw the Maelstrom Zone slipping from his grasp, and all the victories the Warders had gained began to crumble. And so in an attempt to tighten his grip, he remained unaware that elsewhere events were moving against him. It would not be long before the brooding tyrant of Badab would spark into violence, and the Imperium would once again shed the blood of its own. With preliminary judgments into the Badab system in the Segmentum courts weighing in the Administratum's favor, an Imperial investigation fleet, including representatives of the Adeptus Mechanicus biologists and the Administratum lords of the Cathargo sector, were sent to Badab to demand the delivery of Badab tithes and the chapter's gene seed requirements. In circumstances that cannot be fully confirmed or explained, the investigation fleet was fired upon and destroyed in its entirety as it attempted to force its way through the Badab system's so-called Ring of Steel in order to press its demands. No ship survived, and more than 20,000 servants of the Imperium were lost. Soon, claim and counterclaim ensued in the aftermath to how this tragedy occurred, and Huron, delivering his own Dominion's report on the Badab matters to the Segmentum authorities, adamantly insisted that the fleet was fired upon only after refusing to give way to just authority of the system's masters. Within the Cathargo sector, outrage at the incident quickly became widespread, and soon such trade links that had remained between the Maelstrom Zone and the Cathargo sector were abruptly severed, or subject to the harshest scrutiny. The Carthan sector governor, Tanit Koigan, moved to heavily censure the Astroclaws chapter, along with calls for the arrest and trial of Huron for such treacheries against the Imperium. With the weight of suffering and bloodshed elsewhere, the tangle of claims and counterclaims fell on deaf ears. In addition, Huron was the lawful master of the realm, permanently on a war footing, a bulwark against the Xenos and Chaos, and on the most basic level, authorized to defend those domains. Without hard evidence, charged of willful and predetermined homicide against the Imperium servants would be almost impossible to prove in this case. Over the next 3 years, the Carthan Imperial commanders took it upon themselves to send 2 further punitive expeditions into the Maelstrom Zone, but both fleets were lost in unconfirmed circumstances, supposedly near reaching the Badab system. The intervention of the Astroclaws and their allies was suspected. Unable to enforce their will decisively, the increasingly desperate Carthan lords, near bankrupt by this stage, attempted to circumvent Badab itself, taking the far longer and more perilous route in order to access the lost tides directly to make up for their shortfall. By the year 903 of the 41st millennium, the agents of the Carthan Imperial commanders began to spread propaganda in both the Segmentum Assize and the Senatorium Imperialis to any that would listen. As the local administratum continued to press the High Lords to intervene directly, the Maelstrom Warders continued to arm themselves for war and conduct sweeps of the Maelstrom Zone in force, while they simultaneously continued to augment their defenses within the Badab sector itself. To answer the continuing threats to the control of his domain, Huron issued the infamous Article of Just Secession, which were also signed and ratified by the masters of the Lamenters and Mantis Warriors chapter. These documents were designed to formally sever the Maelstrom Zone's direct ties to the neighboring sectors. In support of their cause, the document cited both the edict that founded the Maelstrom Warders and the ancient rights of the titles of the Adeptus Astartes, precedents that both weighed heavily in their favor. These articles also called for a full investigation into the Carthan sector, asserted the historic and lawful sovereignty of Space Marine chapters involved from outside interference by lower Adepta, and stated again their willingness to defend the Maelstrom Zone from any who would threaten it. As the situation devolved further, the Carthans threatened all-out war, but lacked the means to do so alone. Instead, they petitioned aid to mount an attack from the Departamento Minitorum and the Segmentum Naval Subcommand at Riza, but were flatly refused and informed that the matter was an internal dispute. Met with denials, the Carthagor sector itself drafted increasingly large number of troops into its planetary defense regiments. To further their goal, the Carthan satrap sent several direct and open appeals to several Space Marine chapters with whom they had past dealings with. The satrap had quickly realized that only Space Marines could truly hope to contest other Space Marines in open battle. The Firehawks were the first to respond to their cause. At the direct request of the Carthan satrap, elements of the Firehawks chapter of the Adeptus Astartes were sent to investigate the disappearance of the Carthan shipping in the areas of the galactic south of the Golothan Wastes, which bordered the northern reaches of the Maelstrom Zone. In the past, the Firehawks chapter had used the vast orbital dockyards of the Carthan capital world of Sidon Ultra for resupply. The volatile nature of the Firehawks chapter was widely known, and it is likely that this also figured in the Carthan satrap's reasoning in making her request. This monumental arrogance and folly would soon prove disastrous. Conducting search and destroy operations in the Golgothan Wastes, Knight Commander Stibor Lazarex acquisitioned to dispatch several starships into the northern Maelstrom Zone. One such vessel, the Red Harbinger, entered the Erimon cluster in the year 904 of the 41st millennium. This ancient region of space was under the stalwartship of the Mantis Warrior chapter, one of the Astartes chapters that belonged to the alliance of the Maelstrom Warders. When the Red Harbinger entered the Galen system, they were intercepted and surrounded by Mantis Warrior vessels. Ever fierce and proud, they were goaded by the Firehawks' refusal to allow them to board and threats of reprisal, and opened fire, crippling the lone cruiser. With this single act, the full-scale conflict between the Space Marine chapters that was to follow was ignited. The Mantis Warriors boarded and captured the Red Harbinger, but the engagement was brutal to the extreme, as both sides took heavy casualties. Less than 20 Firehawks were captured alive, and none surrendered, but their struggle brought time for an astropathic message to be dispatched to their chapter warning of their fate and who they had fought. Upon learning of the fate of the Red Harbinger, Chapter Master Lazarak and his entire Firehawks chapter became incensed, and withdrew their forces from the operations already underway. The entire chapter fleet deployed with the utmost haste to the Maelstrom Zone. Soon matters escalated upon the arrival of the Firehawks, as they were met at Galen by a task force consisting of both Mantis Warriors and Astroclaw's warships. In a tense standoff, the captives were eventually returned, and both sides traded threats. The Firehawks finally withdrew to await the arrival of their full forces, and especially their massive mobile star fortress, the Raptorus Rex. The Firehawks chapter fleet rendezvoused in the Sagan system, and aided by their Carthan allies, soon launched a series of probing attacks and reconnaissance missions toward the Badab sector and the Erimon cluster. But by doing so, escalated tensions to the point that the situation was rapidly proving dangerous. Having prepared for war for many standard years, the Tyrant of Badab and his allies were battle-hardened and had the advantage of being intimately familiar with the territory of the Maelstrom Zone. The Mantis Warriors proved to be impossible to pin down due to the superlative guerrilla tactics that they employed. Using the Carthans to distract the Astroclaws in the Badab sector, the Firehawks struck the agri-world of Iblis at the edge of the Erimon cluster, attacking civilian targets and burning great swaths of crops and land in order to antagonize the Mantis Warriors into fighting them in open battle. Unfortunately, this type of attack had been anticipated and planned by the Secessionists. As the Mantis Warriors pinned the Firehawks in place on Iblis with their hit-and-run tactics, the Secessionists were able to draw their forces away from Sagan. A combined force of the Astroclaws and Lamentor's chapter soon descended upon the Sagan system and decisively overwhelmed the planetary defense forces and Carthan troops. Badly mauled, the stranded Firehawks and Carthan troops found themselves cut off from supply and behind enemy lines. This forced the Firehawks to withdraw from the planet system, as they racked the surface of the planet one final time and successfully punched through the Secessionist blockade that was attempting to pin them in. The Firehawks' rapturous wrecks claimed the life of the Secessionist Maelstrom Squadron's only Mars-class battlecruiser, Sacred Tesseract. In the process, when the warship's mighty Nova cannon proved unable to prevail against the formidable Star Fortress. A lull descended upon this region following these tumultuous events as the Secessionists consolidated their gains and the Carthans retreated in disarray. Soon the Firehawks, heavily outnumbered and outgunned, were forced into a long period of retreat to the Maelstrom Zone's fringes, which lasted until the year 904 of the 41st millennium, when the Marines' Errant chapter answered the call of the Firehawks for reinforcement. This chapter diverted a sizable force of 6 companies and a fleet of support vessels in order to aid their brother Astartes, although their precise motivation for doing so remains obscure. But soon the starfaring chapter quickly became boggled down protecting Imperial shipping along the Pale Star region and the outlying Maelstrom Zone's colonies as the Secessionists renewed their offensive. The Marines Errant split their forces in an effort to guard the convoys in transit from the increasingly frequent Secessionist raids and attacks. Matters soon became more complicated when the Marines Errant were caught between the Firehawks' desire to destroy Huron's forces at any cost, and the growing need to protect Imperial shipping and the outlying Carthago sector's colonies from the marauding Secessionist forces. This difficulty was further complicated by a conflict of interest due to the ancient ties of loyalty and blood the Marine Errant had forged with the Lamenter's chapter, which they had fought alongside as recently as the Corthan Crusade, but now faced as enemies. This led to incidences where the Marine Errant failed to try to do more than drive off the Lamenter's forces during raids, and in which both parties gave quarter to the other, raising the mutual ire of their respective allies. Towards the year's end, matters worsened as an ever greater number of star systems were drawn into the rapidly escalating war. The Firehawks and their Carthan allies continued to suffer heavy losses in battle. Soon, a dozen worlds had fallen in short order to the Secessionist control, succumbing to direct Secessionist assault by their diplomatic submission to prevent a slaughter of civilians. By the end of the year 904 of the 41st millennium, worse developments for the Carthans and their allies appeared in the form of the notoriously grim and independent Executioner's chapter. News had reached that the Marines Errant and the Executioners had announced their intention to support the Secessionist cause, in payment of an ancient blood oath given by their chapter to the Astral Claws. The Executioners sent their mighty warship, Night Hag, with a full augmented company of Astartes to aid the Secessionists. Desperate, the Carthans were forced to take drastic actions, as their tithes and supplications to the Adeptus Terra were long overdue. Nearly bankrupt by their sector's losses in the war, and with their fleets anchored at Sagan III, now in the hands of the Secessionists, the Carthan Imperial commanders mounted a final attempt to harvest the resources needed to meet their own imperial tithes from the nearby worlds of Villana and Chimera, before the Secessionists could claim these worlds as their own. Unfortunately, the Secessionists' intelligence network had already ascertained every detail of this supposedly secret convoy, and laid a carefully prepared trap, allowing the Carthan convoy to take on the vast amount of wealth awaiting them on Vinaya, before they were attacked as they prepared to transit into the warp. The Secessionist forces, comprised mainly of elements from both the Astral Claws and the Lamenter's chapter's fleets, were led by Huron himself. The Carthan convoy was encircled and then taken one vessel at a time in a series of ferocious ship-to-ship boarding actions. Over 24 vessels were taken as Secessionist prizes, for almost no losses sustained by the attacking forces. Only through the brilliant leadership of Lieutenant Commander Anton Narvaez was the Marine Errant capital ship, Star Jackal, able to escape the tyrant of Badab's cunning trap, fighting its way clear while sustaining heavy damage. By a twist of fate, the damage sustained in the battle caused the Starjackal and its brilliant commander to fall behind the Marine Errant's pursuit of the Mantis warriors to the world of Belleforon's Fall. It would be there that many of the chapter's commanders and senior officers were to die. The Astroclaws fought the Firehawks back to the edge of the Golgothan Wastes, focusing all their attention on eliminating the chapter altogether. The Astroclaws succeeded in inflicting further serious casualties on the chapter, which could no longer be considered an effective fighting force. To make matters worse, for the Imperial Loyalists, the Marine Errant chapter was drawn toward the industrial moon of Belleforon's Falls by the Mantis warriors. The two chapters engaged in fierce combat, but the Mantis warriors managed to isolate and entrap the Marine Errant's 1st and 3rd companies in the Rust Zone, destroying much of their command structure in a series of murderous surgical strikes. The Marines Errant were decimated and forced to retreat in disarray. After the deadly battle, it fell to Lieutenant Commander Narvaez to mount a rescue mission, in which he succeeded in saving and besieging survivors in a daring counter-raid. In the aftermath of this tragedy, it would also fall to Narvaez to take the reign of leadership as the Marines Errant's chapter's last surviving senior officer in the war. Anton Narvaez would later somehow manage to reform the Marine Errant into an effective fighting force once more, although they returned as a mere shadow of their former strength. The alliance between the Firehawks and the Marine Errants all but collapsed. The Secessionist forces would continue to make major advances throughout the rest of the year, almost unopposed. The Maelstrom Zone now belonged almost wholly to Huron, the tyrant of Badab. With 5 different chapters of Space Marines now embroiled in open warfare, with a 6th en route, along with various naval detachments, local defense armies, and the Secturian forces of various Adeptus now involved in what was rapidly accelerating to become the greatest conflict of its kind since the infamous 4th Quadrant Rebellion, the Imperium's high authorities finally acted. A triumvirate of Imperial legates were dispatched under the seal of the High Lords to pronounce judgment over the ongoing strife in the Maelstrom Zone, under orders to leave no stone unturned. Inquisition investigations swiftly uncovered a damning chain of evidence concerning Huron's activities and those of the Astroclaws. Multiple charges were laid out against the tyrant, ranging from the scarcity of returned gene seed tithes to damning evidence of their direct involvement in attacks on Imperial shipping. The Terran legates quickly pronounced that the Badab secession to be a matter of Imperium security rather than a civil conflict. They issued an immediate demand for the unconditional ceasefire of all parties and the surrender of the secessionists. Huron immediately rejected their demands. As a result, the Terran legates issued orders for the immediate arrest pending trial of the chapter master of the secessionist chapters, and the seizure pending judgment of their worlds, goods, records, and the charters by whatever force was deemed necessary. The Imperium was now officially turned against the tyrant of Badab and all those who stood with him. As for the Carthans, their own role in contributing to and worsening the unfolding events of the secession smacked at best of gross arrogance, but more likely wanton ambition and misrule. Legatine investigation carried out at Sidon Ultra, capital of the Carthago sector, confirmed these suspicions. They found the Imperial commander and Carthan sector governor, Satrap, to be part of provoking the war, and she and the world she commanded were brutally punished. Satrap and her ruling clique were subsequently executed, and the Carthans were made to pay for their transgressions, with the entire 14 billion strong population of Sidon Ultra committed to indentured servitude for 6 generations in payment of outstanding debts. Full-scale administratum rectification audits and the Adeptus Arbitus moral enforcement program soon began moving outward across the sector, as tithe costs and reparations to the Adeptus Terra were extracted forcibly from the Carthan worlds. a process that is still going on to this day. The armed cross-sector conflict and its causes, however, remain unresolved, and the war continued unabated. A major deployment of Space Marine forces was brought into the war at the Inquisitorial Thrane's request to enforce their authority. The Red Scorpions chapter formed the greatest part of the Loyalist Space Marine force, backed by battle companies drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, Fire Angels chapter, and the surviving Firehawks and Marine Errant chapters. These latter chapters are ordered to stand down from independent operations and submit to High Lord's authority. Though Inquisitor Thrane had theoretical command of the forces prosecuting the Legate mission's order on behalf of the High Lords, the overall tactical command of the unified Loyalist Space Marine forces fell to Lord High Commander Varant Ortis of the Red Scorpions, a Magister Ultimum, a first amongst equal, in the command of other Space Marine contingents. Given the inherent dangers in dealing with conflicts between the Space Marine chapters and their relative autonomy from direct Imperial control, Inquisitor Legate Thrane had little choice but to go along with the decisions of the gathered Space Marine commanders. But obviously, he would prefer a commander from a more tractable chapter, as the Red Scorpions were famously independent-minded and on occasion fractious chapter in their own right. Lord Commander Ortis's first command was to deploy his own Red Scorpions along with the bulk of the Battlefleet Solar ships to conduct a series of offensive strikes into the Secessionist-controlled region to gauge their resistance. This resulted in the heaviest naval engagement of the war to date, resulting in the indecisive Battle of Silent Reach in the early 906 year of the 41st millennium, when cruiser squadrons of the Maelstrom and Lamenter's fleets clashed with the Segmentum Solar and the Red Scorpions warships in a barren void between the Galen and Grief star system. This engagement proved inconclusive, with both sides suffering damage but few losses of any major ships by both sides. The only serious loss sustained was by the Maelstrom fleet's flagship, the Overlord-class battlecruiser Gauntlet of Wrath. The Secessionist fleet broke off from the engagement into the warp soon afterwards, leaving the Loyalists to claim a tentative victory. A dozen such engagements occurred in the short span of time during this period. The Loyalists quickly succeeded in checking and containing the Secessionist advance in the early part of the war, especially with the addition of the remaining Marine Errant and Firehawk forces after they were cleared of heretical intent. In pursuing this strategy across a broad front, hoping to reveal a weakness in the Secessionist defenses, the Loyalists soon discovered, quite remarkably, that no such weakness was apparent. Thus, the Loyalists were forced to change their strategy. Before they submitted to the Legate's will, the Firehawks had one last act of bloody vengeance to carry out, which has since been entered into Imperial history of the war as the infamous firebombing of Sacristan, in what is widely regarded as a strategical, wasteful, and vainglorious assault. The bitter chapter master of the Firehawks used his surviving chapter fleet, led by the rapturous Rex, to conduct a retaliation orbital assault on the frontier planet of Sacristan, a sovereign world on the edge of the Edimon cluster. Over a period of several days and nights, the Firehawks chapter fleet systematically laid waste to the planet's few cities, slaughtering their inhabitants before they finally withdrew from the system, leaving the planet aflame, wiping out more than 90% of the population. Lord Commander Ortis's next viable target of opportunity presented itself in the form of the Vian system. The Vian was an important world and served as a gatehouse along one of the secondary warp routes around the rim of the Maelstrom. Furthermore, its defenses and garrison were weaker than the heavily reinforced Sagan system. There was further intelligence reports indicating that the Secessionist-occupied world was awash in civil unrest, which might be stirred up into open revolt by the Loyalist attack. While the Firehawks and the newly arrived Raptors chapter conducted patrols and escort operations, the Red Scorpions, Marine Errants, and Nova Marines conducted a three-pronged raid on the system. with the target of damaging its production capacity and orbital transshipping platforms. This would effectively weaken the secessionist grip on the system. Confronting the reformed and reorganized Badab sector human auxilia of the Tyrant's Legion in open warfare, the loyalist Space Marines had greatly underestimated them, and as a result, their strike groups were largely prevented from achieving many of their goals in their first raid. Only 4 orbital platforms were taken out of action, and though they managed to damage the manufactory complexes, production was not significantly affected. Data intercepted from the Command Vox network revealed that the price of the Tyrant Legion's resistance was the Loyalists inflicting a greater than 178-to-1 kill ratio. Later in that year, the Red Scorpion forces conducted the last of these raids, which proved particularly bloody for the Tyrant's Legion. The Red Scorpions invaded the Celian industrial hive with the specific goal of inflicting mass casualties on the human defenders and picking off their Astral Claw masters when they were found within their ranks. Despite the attacks, the secessionists maintained control of the system, and shortly afterwards, further ill news came to the Loyalists, informing them that several military convoys from the rear supply lines from the Carthago sector had been attacked and scattered by unknown warships that later proved to be the Night Hag of the Executioner's chapter. They also received more disturbing news in regards to the fate of the fortress world of Cerngrad, deep within the Maelstrom Zone. Refusing to bend their knee to the tyrant, this fiercely independent world had held out against the secessionist fleet, but Cerngrad had partly succumbed due to treachery from within, and Huron's forces now controlled the northern citadels. Remaining too deep within enemy territories to mount an effective relief operation, the prospect for the ancient fortress world to fall to secessionist control proved to be a grim prospect for the Loyalists for a future siege. After the Viania campaign, there was a brief lull in the constant fighting, an impasse that was unexpectedly broken by the secessionist with a remarkable proposal. Personally sending his emissaries to the Loyalist, Huron offered a temporary ceasefire and an honorable parley with the Magister Ultima in order to avoid further bloodshed between the two parties. Despite the Inquisitor's strong objections, Lord High Commander Ortis agreed to the meeting, trusting Huron's word as a fellow chapter master to maintain the truce. Ortis had equally promised to show his intention to remain iron in his resolve to carry out the judgment of the High Lords. The parley was arranged to take place on the abandoned way station in the orbit around the gas giant Shedem, in the outer reaches of the uninhabited Grief system. Reconstructed from damaged and recovered records, what occurred next remains a point of contention and stubborn enigma to the present day. The station was located on the asteroid mass, abandoned some centuries before due to solar flare activity. Each party consisted of their prospective leaders and their chosen honor guard, which was deposited on the asteroid by Thunderhawks. Upon the opening of negotiations, it was readily apparent that it quickly devolved into a volatile atmosphere. Huron, who was in an impervious mood, commenced by ranting against the Maelstrom Warder's supposed contravention of imperial law. He also went into a ranting rage against his enemies and their perceived enormities and insults. Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors was also present with Huron's party, who swiftly accused the Firehawks chapter of perpetrating wanton crimes of genocide. For his part, Varant Ortis stood firm, reiterating the legate right of authority and the unassailable right of summons. Soon an adjournment was called for, as the talks became heated and both parties withdrew to separate compartments of the station to confer with their fellows. Matters of records regarding the following incidents become muddled and contradictory. Loyalist communication to their strike cruisers was suddenly cut off as 3 unknown vessels attacked from concealed positions deep within the thick atmosphere of the gas giant Shedem. These attackers assaulted the asteroid base before either Loyalist or Secessionist vessels could respond, taking the way station with a devastating salvo of weapon fire before boarding with a raiding party comprised of heretics, mutants, and other renegades. In the ensuing melee, the Loyalist delegation, including Lord Commander Ortis, was killed, and several members of Huron's party, including Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, were also slain. During the three-way space battle around the way station, the Red Scorpion's chief librarian, Servin Loth, valiantly launched a counterattack and recovered his fallen Chapter Master's remains. The Red Scorpions clashing with both the Raiders and Huron's Astro Claws before both sides broke free from the disintegrating asteroid base to avoid certain death. Severin Loth had saved the honor of his chapter against all odds, and in doing so, wrote an enduring legend for himself, despite the bitter blow that the Red Scorpions had suffered. During the resultant chaos, the tyrant had somehow managed his escape early on, and what hand he had in the death of Lord Commander Ortis or even Chapter Master Sartak cannot be confirmed. In the aftermath of this incident, which became to be referred to as the Betrayal at Grief, many within the Loyalist ranks blame Huron for the attack, claiming it as a rank treachery, while the Secessionists lay the blame at the feet of the Inquisition as a plot to assassinate the tyrant by covert means. Inquisitor Frayne concluded that the incident may have been due to the possible intervention of third parties of maleficent design, whose wishes to benefit from the continuation of the war as the whole region descended into bloodshed and anarchy. Frayne also didn't rule out the possibility that the plot was carried out by Huron himself in order to assassinate his would-be ally Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors. Ortis's death merely served to seal the assassination in a shroud of doubt for friends and foe alike. Evidence from that tie had been the uncovering of growing disquiet among the Mantis Warriors in their support for the secessionist cause. Committed as they were to protecting their fellow Maelstrom warders from the outside aggression and defending their sacred independence and right of the Astartes, they still saw the direct judgment of the High Lords as something not to be disregarded. Rumors concerning the rule of the Astro Claws within their own dominions had begun to circulate, and had been the cause of disquiet for some time. Sartak's death more than likely served to ensure that the Mantis Warriors' resolve, particularly if it could be laid at the feet of an enemy chapter. So much the better if the enemy would blame the Mantis Warriors for the death of their own. Now that the possibility of peace between the two opposing sides had been effectively destroyed, the war soon escalated even further, with no quarter given by the Red Scorpions or Astro Claws. Soon, secrets would be uncovered that would lend the secession as even darker. With the death of Chapter Master Ortis, the strategic initiative was temporarily delivered into the hands of the secessionists, and raids against Imperial shipping increased. For a time, the Loyalists were sorely pressed to hold what little ground they had taken in the Maelstrom Zone. The Pale Stars were all but entirely cut off, and heavy Space Marine escort forces were required in order to maintain access to the world of Galen and Kaigmara. The situation was finally eased with the arrival of contingents of the Howling Griffins, Nova Marines, and later the Sons of Medusa chapters, and the appointment of Carib Coln, the new High Lord Commander of the Red Scorpions, as the new Magister Militum of the Loyalist forces. As his chapter defined such things, Coln had grown forthright, proud, and above all, fiercely loyal to the Red Scorpions during the illustrious career. From this reason, Coln was viewed as the natural successor of Lord High Commander Verant Ortis, the chapter master of the Red Scorpions. During the Badab War, his transition to the position of Lord High Commander and Magister Militum after the death of Ortis on the World of Grief at the hands of the renegade Astro Claws was greeted with wide acclaim by his battle brothers, and most importantly, blessed by the chapter chief librarian Servin Loth, who oversaw the change of command and quelled any dissent. Coln's ascension had been contested primarily by the Firehawks chapter master, Stibor Lazarak, who demanded that he instead should be granted overall command of the Loyalist forces in the conflict due to his seniority and the long honorable service to the Imperium. As Ortis's successor, Coln was entitled to step into the mantle of his predecessor as Magister Militum and overall commander of the Loyalist forces, but this was by no means guaranteed. With the principal support of the Raptors and Salamanders chapter, as well as his own impassioned pleas in the Loyalist War Council that he had the right of vengeance and the proven mettle required to see the war to its end, Coln secured the support of the Fire Angels and Nova Marines for his command. Both the Sons of Medusa and the Marines Errant then agreed to his selection for reasons of their own. Despite some continual minor dissent, Carib Coln was acclaimed as the second Magister Militum of the Imperial Crusade to retake the Maelstrom Zone from the Secessionists. Coln quickly took control of the situation and brought forward plans to convert the old way station on the largely abandoned mining world of Hollows Point into the first primary Loyalist base and staging point in the Maelstrom Zone proper. With ships and materials moving into the system with great dispatch, Vengeance Station, as it became known, was fully operational in under a standard year. The Loyalists retook the offensive initiative even before Vengeance Station was completed. Soon, a renewed phase of aggression was ready to take place, with the Red Scorpions chapter particularly eager for battle. However, their eagerness was tempered by their own new master and the wise counsel of Chief Librarian Severin Loth, who promised their battle brothers a bloody but carefully considered retribution. By the close of the year 906 of the 41st millennium, dozens of separate void actions had already been fought by Red Scorpion detachments, ranging from defending convoys to raiding outposts and intercepting secessionist shipping alongside the Raptors, turning the tide against Huron's raid for the first time. At the same time, the Loyalists were bolstered by the fresh forces from the Nova Marines and Sons of Medusa chapters, who immediately carried out probing attacks into the region of the Edimon cluster and against the edges of the Sagan system, maintaining pressure on the secessionists and keeping their forces pinned down. During this new campaign, the Loyalists garrisoned the barren Chimera system and established several outposts and listening stations in order to conduct sustained operations in the contested Gargathian system. Gargathea III was a feral world of poisonous fens and corrosive jungles. This heavily contested world soon turned into a savage battleground as the Raptors, Salamanders, and Fire Angels chapters clashed against the Astral Claws and the Mantis Warriors amid the tangled and often lethal vegetation. The war on Gargathea swiftly developed into a series of hit-and-run engagements of ambush and counterattack. The battle lines on Gargathea remained non-linear, except for a few scattered landmarks on half-overgrown exploratory bases and old smuggler outposts. The outcome of such vicious fighting was uncertain, and a high amount of casualties were sustained on both sides. Gargathea remained a contested world of vital strategic importance due to the planet being one of the few life-sustaining worlds in the region. The secessionist forces were finally displaced from the planet at the end of the year 907 of the 41st millennium, and the system reclaimed for the Loyalists. With the arrival of fresh reinforcements to replace them in the order of battle, the Marine Errant first took up reserve duty for the remainder of the year, before they finally withdrew entirely from the Badab War early in the year 907 of the 41st millennium, with some acrimony attached to their departure. The Firehawks chapter, who grew increasingly embittered, were forcibly retired to the rear guard for a time by the newly appointed Magister Militum, Lord High Commander Carbel Coln, in order to avoid further trouble in the ranks of the Loyalist forces. This redeployment of the Firehawks was proved particularly effective as the presence of their mighty Raptorous Rex at Hollows Point ensured the security of the Loyalist facilities while under construction. The presence of the mobile Star Fortress soon proved vital when the Hollow Points were raided in the year 906 of the 41st millennium
by secessionist vessels, led by a trio of Lamenter chapter strike cruisers. The attack was repulsed without major damage to the half-finished base, as the concentration firepower of both the Raptorus Rex and the Red Scorpion's battle barge Sword of Ordon proved a decisive factor. The scales began to tip in the Loyalists' favor, as further reinforcement arrived almost month by month, with messages from the Adeptus Terra informing them that other Space Marine chapters were en route. Lord High Commander Colm knew that he must press his advantage soon or risk the war devolving into a slow battle of attrition that would bleed his forces dry. The first move forward would be the relief of the fortress world of Cerngrad that stubbornly held out against the secessionist aggression by their heroic self-sacrifice and single bloody-minded faith in the God Emperor. The Raptors and Salamanders chapter were assigned the task of intervention by sending a select strike force dispatched on a long-range incursion missile behind secessionist lines. The Raptors covertly landed a strong force of battle brothers in field-modified armor over 300 kilometers away from their chosen target. Shunning heavy gear and vehicles in favor of reduced visibility to auspex and thermal detectors, the Raptors' war party launched a lightning assault under the cover of a blinding gale and succeeded in breaching the fortress walls of the main orbital defense complex with melta-bombs, gaining entrance. They then successfully sabotaged the base's weapon silos despite taking heavy casualties from a bitterly contested counterattack by the Astroclaws. With the way open, the two chapters' battle barges bombarded the planet from the upper atmosphere, smashing the secessionist-held positions into sunder and liberating Cerngrad. The liberation of Cerngrad marked a turning point in the war, as the Loyalists began to drive a potential wedge down the middle of the secessionist world. But before they could take advantage of this new game, dire news came from the Howling Griffin station at Kimara of a deadly new threat. Inquisitorial interrogation of the Astroclaw's apothecary captured during the Battle of Cerngrad's polar fortress revealed to the general shock of the interrogators that the prisoner was not in fact an Astroclaw by origin at all, but in fact a former member of the Tiger Claws, a chapter long thought lost. The Astroclaws' hubris resulted in their chapter secretly absorbing the remnants of their long-lost successor chapter into their ranks, and ultimately led to Huron's dreams of expanding his chapter into a force with the strength of one of the Space Marine legions of antiquity, in order to pacify the Maelstrom Zone permanently and crush mankind's enemies. Some Imperial scholars contend that when the last remaining Tiger Claw survivors were taken into the Astroclaw's midst, these once loyal brothers grasped a poisonous viper in their heart, thus causing them to eventually cause them to fall from grace. Further dire and extreme methods were then unleashed in utter secrecy as a planned series of stalk and capture raids when engaged upon the covert Astartes and the inquisitorial forces operating within the Maelstrom Zone. Evidence was quickly amassed of an unforeseen and terrible heresy that would be pursued by the Astroclaws and Huron for more than a century. The tyrant had ordered the withholding of his chapter's gene seed tithes, not to replenish the chapter's own losses, but at first, in order to help save the remnants of the decimated ranks of their nearly extinct kin, the Tiger Claws chapter, which had sought sanctuary with them in secret. Huron and his fellows hid them within the Astroclaws' ranks. He then further compounded this sin by seeking to expand his own forces far past the levels mandated by the Codex Astartes. For at least 100 years before the outbreak of the conflict, the Astroclaws secretly attempted to transform their chapter slowly into a force equal to a Space Marine legion of old. In his monumental arrogance and pride, Huron sought at first not to rebel against the Imperium, but to prove his case by scourging the Maelstrom clean and establishing a new realm carved out for mankind in the name of the Emperor. To outside scrutiny, the tyrant placed Astroclaws detachments within the tyrant's legion's ranks before outbreak of the war as trainers, tasked with purging and improvement of the mediocre and often corrupted planetary defense force armies of the Badab sector. But in reality, the Legion's tribunes were in all cases passed off as the force's commanders. This succeeded in concealing the true numbers of the tyrant's growing chapter from prying eyes, and enabled the Astroclaws to disperse this hidden force all across Huron's domain, hidden within the tyrant's legion. The betrayal of the tyrant and the Astroclaws rapidly became apparent when the Badab War engulfed the Maelstrom Zone, as did the identity of the true commanders of the tyrant legions, who willingly followed their master without falter, taking up arms against any who would challenge the tyrant's domains. Further covert investigation uncovered that the Astroclaws' apothecaries had also been conducting heretical experiments in rapid zygote cultivation, and while largely unsuccessful thanks to the use of its untithed gene seed, the Astroclaws chapter stood at around an estimated 3,500 battle brothers strong. A disastrous defeat for the Loyalist forces in the early year of 907 of the 41st millennium would mark the bloodiest year of the conflict, for the bulk of the Executioners chapter had arrived in force in the Maelstrom Zone and immediately conducted immediate surprise attacks on Chimera. They succeeded in destroying the Loyalist outpost, listening stations, and vital astropathic relay complexes on the Night's Moon of Kirma's system in one stroke. The Howling Griffin's chapter forces garrisoning the Chimar system were outnumbered and overwhelmed, suffering greatly as their bastions and stations fell one after the other despite their tenacious defense. The Howling Griffins were systematically destroyed by the relentless onslaught of the Executioners from an unseen quarter. As the Howling Griffins' positions were being outrun and decimated on the airless Dust Moon, it fell to the dreadnought Confessor Titus to rally the beleaguered forces of his chapter. Unafraid of the firestorm around him, with implacable zeal, the venerable dreadnought chaplain led the desperate counterattack, which bought his chapter the chance to regroup and mount an effective fighting defense at the cost of his long life. After the Executioners had finally withdrawn from the battlefield, the surviving Howling Griffins found that their foe had honored Tice's glorious sacrifice by laying out the wreck of his sarcophagus within a ring of broken weapons, placing one of their own shattered standards in a lifeless grasp of the fallen war machine. The death of the revered dreadnought Confessor Titus struck a hammer blow to the Howling Griffin's morale. With the Chimera system's defensing platforms and listening stations destroyed, the Executioner forces had achieved their primary objective. They could have pressed their advantage and utterly destroyed the Howling Griffin's outpost, but instead withdrew suddenly from the system, leaving the Howling Griffin's garrison with more than 70% casualties. This development provoked much concern from Huron, but mindful of the dangerous temperament of the Executioner's commander, the High Chaplain Thulsa Kane, he was known to have stopped short of issuing any formal reprimand to them, and instead welcomed them into the battle of the Secessionist cause. Despite the grievous losses dealt to them, the remainder of the Howling Griffin's task force continued to doggedly attack, refusing to shrink away from their responsibilities to the Loyalist cause, until formally relieved from the war in the year 909 of the 41st millennium. Taking advantage of the anarchy that reigned within the Maelstrom Zone, it was unsurprising that attacks from unaligned raiding forces and Xeno races based within the turbulence expanse of the Maelstrom Zone dramatically increased, reaching a new height during the year 907 of the 41st millennium. The Secessionists suffered the worst at the hands of these non-aligned forces during the Badab War. A large Orc Corsair fleet spilled forth from the Kala system, assaulting Secessionist supply convoys between the Edimon cluster and the Badab sector, and ultimately assaulted the Mantis warriors at Edimon itself. A large force of over 20,000 boys proceeded to slaughter the planet's meager garrison, forcing the Mantis warriors to pull back to defend Edimon and meet the Orcs in a rapid-moving land battle on the dusk plains of Orila, lest they lose their world. As serious as the orc attack against the cluster was, there was far more worse implications of the growing threat of the demon-tainted Corsair cults based on the blighted world of Magog. Their increase in power had actually driven forth the recently defeated orcs. This forced the Secessionists to launch a direct assault on the hellish world, which despite a prior Exterminatus campaign, had long remained a thorn in the Maelstrom Warder's side. Corian Sumartis, one of Huron's most seasoned battle captains, commanded an Astroclaw's battle barge and conducted the attack on the planet. A force of 2 companies of the chapter and a strong force of hand-picked Astroclaws and Lamenter's Terminators successfully cut off the threat while it was still forming. The tyrant knew well they could ill afford the risk of fighting a war on 2 fronts if they continued to allow this dire threat on Magog to continue. Though a costly diversion that caused a high number of fatalities, the Secessionists were able to reinforce their flanks just as new enemies entered the conflict. The powerful fleet-based chapter of Dark Renown, the Minotaurs, arrived in full strength in the Maelstrom Zone in the mid-907th year of the 41st millennium. They announced their presence in the war by launching a full chapter-scale assault on the Secessionist-controlled mining facility on Cairo, wiping out 46,000-strong Tyrant's Legion garrison and rendering the mine works unusable. Afterwards, the Minotaurs sent a ship with a representative and officially presented themselves to the Loyalist Council of War. Their master, the darkly famed Asterion Moloch, remained with his chapter to raid through the Pale Star region in order to decimate rather than conquer a pre-planned list of resource production within the region in order to starve the Secessionist War Effort. While the Minotaur chapter ceded over strategic authority to the War Council of the Loyalist chapters already engaged in the conflict, they deliberately stayed largely aloof and distant from its general chain of command, distancing themselves from the other chapters, as was their wont, and deferring to the Legate Inquisitor's authority more often than the Lord High Commander, Carib Coln, or his advisors. This distance was shown in their standing representative to the War Council, the gaunt, brooding, and taciturn chaplain Ivanus Enkomai, whose red-rimmed eyes observed all, although he barely spoke a word during the gatherings. The Minotaur's chapter master, Moloch, never put in a personal appearance at this council, and the only evidence that he served during the Badab conflict at all came from the picked footage recovered from battle scans and fearful stories spreading by few Secessionist survivors of the Minotaurs' brutal attacks. The Minotaurs had come in answer to the direct summons from acting Legate Inquisitor for more Space Marines to join the Loyalist cause against the Secessionist chapter, though the arrival of this savage chapter was cautiously welcomed by the Loyalists. They undoubtedly couldn't deny the considerable strength that would be added to the Imperium's cause. The conflict was in its 4th year of open warfare, and the Minotaurs committed their entire strength to the war. 10 companies and 11 capital ships of various types. While the chapter coordinated their efforts with the Loyalist command, they operated largely independent throughout the conflict, striking targets as they saw fit. The Minotaurs attacked indiscriminately, attacking not only the 30-plus Secessionist-controlled minor worlds and stations, but also overlooked independent minor outposts. Operating largely independently in the southern Maelstrom Zone, the Minotaurs proceeded to strike targets amid the Pale Stars and Dene Stellar Drift border region. The viciousness of the chapter's reputation for leaving no survivors among those that resisted them quickly grew, and remained uncontested until the arrival of the even more savage Carcharodon's chapter. It's about to get real. Only the warships and strike forces of the Executioners seemed to be able to halt the Minotaurs' progress within the region, the 2 chapters seemingly relishing the battle between them as a kind of bloody sport. For the remainder of the year, the Minotaurs gained several important victories for the Loyalist cause, destroying the Tyrant Legion's forces on Krau's world and Larsa, and forced the Astroclaws to withdraw or risk having their worlds isolated and ravaged one by one. Within 1/3 of a standard year of the Minotaurs arriving in the region, the direct and collateral damage caused by their forces reduced the human population of the Pale Stars by more than 20%. The power of their chapter quickly proved a decisive weight in the Loyalists' favor, regardless of its brutal methods. By the end of the 907th year of the 41st millennium, the Secessionists had been able to be pushed back from several key systems and suffer several losses. In the northern central Maelstrom Zone, the battle for Galen between the Astral Claws and a joint force of Salamanders and Fire Angels eventually resulted in the Loyalists successfully taking the system. To further add to the Secessionists' dreadful losses was the loss of Viania, which finally fell after a massive joint assault by the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions chapter. Huron had all but abandoned the world, and the sizable Tyrant's Legion garrison stationed there. As the Angels of Death fell amongst the beleaguered defenders, their end was swift and brutal, and by dawn, Viania was in the Loyalists' hands, as the Tyrant's Legion was put to the sword. In the early 908th year of the 41st millennium, Inquisitorial agents had acquired evidence of a plot between the Astral Claws and renegade heretic scavengers from the Golgothan Wastes. They had devised a plan to acquire recovered buried weapons stored on the dead world of Signax. The Sons of Medusa task force, backed by a newly arrived company from the Exorcist chapter, were given this task. Given the chief role in this task, the Sons of Medusa led the determined and brutal campaign to scour out the Tyrant's forces, the conduct of which caused some discord between the two chapters, with accusations that the Sons of Medusa were more interested in pursuing their own mysterious agenda instead of hunting down the enemy as expeditiously as possible. The Exorcists soon withdrew and redeployed their forces for the forthcoming assault on the Sagan system, leaving the Sons of Medusa to eliminate the Synax threat as they saw fit. The Second Battle of Sagan was a major planetary assault undertaken in the year 908 of the 41st millennium. It drove the Secessionists from their fortress in the Sagan subsector. The assault was carried out by the largest combined Loyalist force fielded to the point during the Badab War. This offensive utilized the mass strength of the Fire Angels, Red Scorpions, and the Exorcist chapter, supported by assaulted specialized forces drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, and Nova Marines. The Secessionists chose to mount a defense at any cost rather than give up the strategically vital Sagan system. The fighting proved to be bloody and costly in the extreme. In a desperate attempt to either drive the Loyalists from the surface of Sagan III or render the planet unusable to them, the Astral Claws resorted to the use of viral weapons that slew tens of thousands on the world's populations. This use of weapons of mass destruction ultimately destroyed a sizable component of the Secessionists' own battle lines. The Fire Angels deployed their full chapter strength and bore the brunt of the Loyalist casualties, valiantly sacrificing themselves in order to contain the Astral Claws' desperate final attempt to drive their foes from the world through the utilization of suicide attacks. This campaign resulted in the highest death toll of any single engagement of the war to this point, as well as the loss of several key Secessionist warships in a vain counterattack on the system. The successful invasion of the Sagan system proved to be a major turning point of the war. After the system fell under the Loyalist control, it became the primary Imperial base in the Maelstrom Zone, affording the Loyalist offensive greater access to the primary stable warp routes into the region, while denying those routes to the enemy. Shortly afterward, at the end of the campaign, Sagan III was used as a supply point in order to fully relieve and reinforce Cerngrad and support the start of the Edimon suppression campaign. This Loyalist advance effectively forced the remaining Mantis warrior forces into a purely defensive posture, isolating them from the Badab sector and their Secessionist allies. After the Second Battle of Sagan, the Maelstrom Zone was effectively split into two regions, the Edimon cluster and the still heavily defended Badab sector itself. From this point onward in the conflict, the Secessionists were able to conduct commerce raids and targeted strikes which were carried out by the vessels of the Executioners and Lamenters chapter's fleet.
my freedom first in any situation.